I'm Steve Burgess, Professor of Civil Engineering at the University of Washington and immediate past President of the Hydrology Section of the American Geophysical Union. It's my pleasure to interview today Professor Peter S. Eagleson, one of our most distinguished colleagues and known affectionately to all as Pete. We are both attending the spring annual meeting of the American Geophysical Union in Baltimore and chose to conduct our interview here on the Johns Hopkins University campus in this very pleasant setting. It is a beautiful spring day, this 28th day of May in 1997. This interview is one of a series by the Hydrology Section of the American Geophysical Union under our History of Hydrology program. The series was started in the mid-1980s and restarted by Dave Doherty, chair of the History Committee, in 1995. Our interview is the 8th in the current series. Professor Eagleson is the Edmund K. Turner Professor Emeritus of Civil and Environmental Engineering and the Professor of Earth, Atmosphere, and Planetary Science Emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he became emeritus there in 1993. He was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on February 27, 1928. He graduated from Cheltenham High School in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania in 1945. He earned his BS in 1949 and his MS in 1952, both in civil engineering from Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He earned his Doctor of Science, SCD, in civil engineering from MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1956. His scientific and professional career has been spent at MIT. Professor Eagleson has been honored on numerous occasions for some of his many scientific contributions and for his intellectual, scientific, and professional leadership. His awards include the Desmond Fitzgerald Medal of the Boston Society of Civil Engineers in 1959, the Huber Research Prize of the American Society of Civil Engineers in 1963, the Clemens Herschel Prize of the Boston Society of Civil Engineers in 1965, the Robert E. Horton Award of the American Geophysical Union in 1979, then the prestigious Robert E. Horton Medal, a union-wide medal of the American Geophysical Union for outstanding contributions to the geophysical aspects of hydrology, and that was in 1988. He was honored in 1991 by the International Association of Hydrologic Science with the awarding of the International Hydrology Prize. In 1994, he received the most prestigious medal bestowed on anybody in geophysics from the American Geophysical Union, the William Bowie Medal, for outstanding contributions to fundamental geophysics and for unselfish cooperation in research. This August, he will travel to Stockholm, Sweden to receive the Stockholm Water Prize from King Carl Gustaf XVI. His distinguished lectureships include the John R. Freeman Memorial Lecturer, Boston Society of Civil Engineers in 1977, the Chester C. Kissel Memorial Lecture at the University of Arizona in 1985, the Robert E. Horton Memorial Lecturer, the American Meteorological Society in 1990, the Sterling B. Henricks Lecturer, the Sterling B. Henricks Memorial Lecturer, United States Agricultural Research Service in 1991. The Thomas B. Nolan Distinguished Lecturer from the U.S. Geological Survey, also in 1991. He gave the inaugural Walter B. Langbein Memorial Lecture of the American Geophysical Union for the Hydrology Section in 1993. He was invited by the American Society of Civil Engineers to give the Distinguished Rouse Lecture in 1995. He is an elected Fellow of the American Geophysical Union, and that occurred in 1973, the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1990, and the Citation for Advances in Understanding the Interaction of Climate, Soil, and Vegetation, and for Leadership in the Development of Hydrologic Science. He is an elected Fellow of the American Meteorological Society in 1990. In 1992, he was elected a member of the United States National Academy of Engineering, the most distinguished recognition an engineer can be given in the United States. His recognition there was for leadership in the theoretical foundations of modern hydrology. This year, 1997, he is the holder of the Bellagio residency of the Rockefeller Foundation. His colleagues at MIT have honored him too. He held the Edmund K. Turner Professorship from 1984 to his retirement in 1993. His colleagues in his home department of Civil and Environmental Engineering gave him the Effective Teaching Award in 1991-92 academic year. Each year, MIT honors one of its absolutely distinguished colleagues with the James R. Killen Jr. Faculty Achievement Award. Pete received that prestigious award in academic year 1992-93 for extraordinary professional accomplishments. Pete has given much to the profession. He has provided extraordinary leadership in many scientific and professional societies. His leadership in the American Geophysical alone, from the period 1980 to 1994, includes Chair of the Horton Medal Subcommittee, Member of the Committee of Fellows, President-elect of the Hydrology Section, President of the Hydrology Section. Then he took on the very demanding task of President-elect of the Union from 1984 to 1986, and President of the Union from 86 to 88. Served as past President until 1990, and gave service as a member of the Bowie Medal Subcommittee, chaired the Union Nominating Committee from 1990 to 92, and has chaired the Revell Medal Subcommittee. He has provided critical leadership to the National Research Council, which is the operating arm of the National Academy of Science, the National Academy of Engineering, and the Institute of Medicine. He was a founding member of the Water Science and Technology Board from 1982 to 1986. He chaired and provided the intellectual leadership of the Water Science and Technology Board's Committee on Opportunities in the Hydrologic Sciences from 1987 to 1990. He served on the Commission on Geosciences, Environment and Resources from 1988 to 1994, and on the Board of Global Change from 1991 to 1993. Pete, the biostatistician Carl Pearson, who lived from 1857 to 1936, wrote, "It's impossible to understand a man's work unless you understand something of his environment. And his environment means the state of affairs, social and political, of his own age." Would you like to tell us something of your childhood years, your mother, your father, things you did there, and we'll take up from there as we go along.
Thank you, Steve. I think it's important that we do that. Pearson was a wise man. And as you said, I was born in Philadelphia in 1928. I spent my childhood years in a small town called Wyncote, Pennsylvania, which is one of the northeastern suburbs of Philadelphia. My mother, who was schooled at the University of Michigan and the University of Georgia, was a librarian and practicing library science in Orlando, Florida, until she met my father and married him. My father prepped for Princeton at the Lawrenceville Academy in New Jersey, just outside of Princeton, where he seemed to major in sports and baseball, to the point at which he was summarily dismissed from Lawrenceville for what has been termed inappropriate behavior. I never was able to find out just what that meant, but I have my own guesses.
And didn't want to know either.
I didn't want to, well, I did, but I never found out. After he was dismissed, he toured the country and worked at a number of manual labor jobs, came back to Philadelphia, and because he had been such a good pitcher on the Lawrenceville team, he was offered a professional baseball contract by Connie Mack, then the owner and manager of the Philadelphia Athletics. My grandfather, since he was a minor, my grandfather would have had to sign the contract to make it legal, and he felt that these were just bums in those days, the professional baseball players, and he didn't want my father associating with them. So he refused to sign. And I think that haunted my father for the rest of his life. He was a frustrated baseball player, and he may have incidentally passed a little bit of that along to me, if not genetically, at least environmentally. He went to work as a stockbroker in Philadelphia in the 20s, in the roaring 20s, and did quite well. We lived in the lap of luxury, I would say, until the crash came along in 1929 and the Depression, which cost him in sequence his job, our home, and his health. And in the depths of the Depression, I guess it must have been around 32 or 33, I don't remember, we had to leave, sell that house and moved in with my grandmother, who lived on a large estate in Wyncote. She also lived very handsomely. Her husband, my grandfather, having made a small fortune in the grocery business after coming over from Ireland as a small boy. My father ultimately had a stroke in 1941, which disabled him seriously, and he remained disabled until 1951 when he had a second stroke which killed him. While my mother was responsible for my intellectual development, my father was responsible for my baseball development, and as I remember my younger years, rainy days I spent indoors reading pretty much, and I guess my mother guided my reading. Although my father was interested in poetry, and he saw to it that I read poetry. My father was responsible for the fair day activities, and he made sure that my brother and I learned how to play baseball, which we did sun up to sundown on such days, usually with the two children of approximately the same age that my grandmother's chauffeur Gardner had.
Okay. Pete, the early years, there's a lot reflected in there with activity there, but let's think about high school and how things might have motivated, or were you motivated, or what it would be, and anything that might have even led to where you ended up going to university, etc.
Well, as you said earlier, my high school years were 1943 to 1945 in the Cheltenham High School, and these were wartime years. And I guess all the males of my age were preoccupied with the war. I know I had a large world map in my room. Every day I listened to the news and moved colored pins to mark the progress of our troops in both theaters of the war, in the Pacific and in Europe. And it was certainly on my mind that I was ultimately going to have to serve. In fact, with the bravado of a young boy at that age, I was anxious to, not knowing what it really was all about. I was very active in sports. I acquired that interest from my father, as I said, and I paid more attention to sports than I did to academics in school. The school was not, I guess it was a good one if you had the motivation. The stuff was there to learn, but I wasn't motivated and they didn't require much of us. So I didn't have a very good record. And in those years, while the scholastic aptitude tests existed, they weren't required by most colleges for admission to college. And while my mother made it clear to me she wanted me to go to college and not to enlist in the Army, our principal, on whose recommendation the college would grant or withhold admission, said I would never get into any engineering school in the country. He wouldn't recommend me. I had acquired some kind of an interest in suspension bridges, and I thought I wanted to be a civil engineer and build these grand structures.
Pete, back to your principal, and was a bit discouraging there. Is there anything that he might have done that you're thinking in hindsight that just might have put the spark into you to have another go?
Well, you know, he lived nearby. He lived at the bottom of our street, only about 4 houses away, and he was a friend of my mother's. And while I didn't get along with him, she did. And I don't know what happened behind my back, but my mother was a very smart and shrewd lady, and she may have put him up to this refusal of the recommendation in order to motivate me, because it certainly had that effect. I managed to get into college because I had a friend in high school whose brother had gone on to Lehigh and then become the assistant director of admissions. So my friend was going to go to Lehigh, and he said, Pete, come on along with me. He said, Paul will get you in. So Paul got me into Lehigh, and the first day there, practically, he came around to me and he said, Pete, if you can get a 3.0 your first term, that's 3.0 out of 4.
Yeah, they were real grades then.
They were real grades. There was no grade inflation in those days. If you can get a 3.0, I'll take you out to the best restaurant in Bethlehem for dinner. And that was quite a challenge to me. I've always been competitive. And I thought, by golly, I'm going to win that dinner. And I really worked. I worked mighty hard. I worked long hours, weekends, and I got the 3.0 and got the dinner. And I think that established the working patterns which have stayed with me through most of my life. My brother also went to Lehigh.
Okay.
You may have been interested in what happened to him. He was 2 years older than me, and we passed through Cheltenham High School in that way. I was always looking up to him, and particularly intellectually, because he was a real intellectual, and he worked hard in school. And he had very poor eyesight, so he was not draftable upon completion of high school. He went off to Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and was in a pre-engineering program there. When suddenly the military changed its standards, medical standards, and he became eligible and was drafted into the Navy, where he served until his discharge in 1946, I think, when he came and joined me at Lehigh.
So
and he studied business.
So you both ended up overlapping at Lehigh.
We did for a couple of years.
Because of several reasons, right?
That's right.
So when he came to Lehigh and he studied business, why don't we take along and see where your brother went from there?
Yeah, well, he was interested in finance. So when he graduated with highest honors from Lehigh, he was hired by the Federal Reserve Bank in Philadelphia. And he worked there for a while, and while he was working, they sent him to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania for a master's degree in finance. And when he completed that, they wanted him to go on for the PhD, but again, he was worried about his eyes. The intensive studying was making his eyes worse. So he did not do that. He left the Federal Reserve Bank and went to work for what was then the Girard Bank in Philadelphia. Girard Trust Company, actually. And he rose through the ranks at Girard to become president and then chief executive officer or whatever those titles are, but he was a top man anyway, and finally engineered the merger of the Girard Trust Company with the Mellon Bank of Pittsburgh. And he then, out of that merger, became chairman of the Mellon National Corporation, and that's the position he held upon his retirement.
So I'd suggest if you have interest in baseball as a youngster, you're competitive, you might end up as a banker. If you perhaps don't compete so hard in high school, you become a world-class scientist engineer.
I don't know if it says that. But
one part there, perhaps people watching this interview may not know that the Wharton School is probably the country's premier finance school, so he was in the best place at the time, and that background preparation probably influenced a lot how he did.
He's always been very good at whatever he does.
Well, I think there may be a family gene there, Pete, because I think you do pretty well at most things you do, too.
I think it was stressed at home. My father always used to say to us, don't do anything that you can't do well.
Right.
Never do less than your best.
Pete, let's go back now. Now, we've taken your brother through his very distinguished career. Let's go back now and sort of see your undergrad career and then where you went from there, because you were still tied up in wartime years, and then where you went from there and lead into other studies.
Well, you probably know that the colleges in this country were on the accelerated program during the war, and they didn't have summer vacations as we have now. So I started at Lehigh on the day following my graduation from high school. So there was no summer vacation for me, having completed my senior year of high school. And then I did a summer term at Lehigh in civil engineering. Now I was a freshman in civil engineering, and then I completed my freshman year in the fall, what would be the fall semester, started my sophomore year in the spring. I played freshman baseball on the Lehigh team. There weren't many players in those days. All the men were off at war, so it was easy for me to make the team as a freshman. But I learned something quickly. I was playing with the big boys, and I couldn't hit the curve. So my baseball career was coming to a fairly rapid end. But at the end of that year, 1946, I needed mental health leave. I'd been going to school for too long. So I took a summer off and did two things. I played baseball for half the summer on an amateur team outside of Philadelphia. And in the second half of the summer, I was a merchant seaman, cattleman actually, shepherding horses from this country to war-torn Europe to replace those that had been killed during the war.
Right.
and then back to school again in the fall. And I graduated in 1949, and in order to help pay my way through college, I had waited on tables, and I had joined the advanced ROTC because that brought some income.
Reserved Officer Training Corps.
Yes, Reserve Officer Training Corps. And that brought some additional income, but it also brought an obligation. There was a Selective Service Act in those days, which included officers who got their commissions through the ROTC. So when I graduated, I had a commission as a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers, but I also had an obligation to serve for 21 months on active duty to recompense the federal government for their support of me through school. And so I was duly called up upon graduation. I married and went off in the Army to serve on the island of Okinawa.
Now, you're 21 at this stage.
I was 21.
Right.
Off to serve as a second lieutenant in the construction battalion on the island of Okinawa, where we spent our time replacing housing and buildings which blew into the East China Sea by the typhoons that sweep across there in season. The economy turned sour in the United States at about that time, in 1949, 1950, and the Secretary of War convinced President Truman that the Selective Service Act should be modified to let draftees out at the end of a year as an economy move for the government. If they desired to leave, they could still stay and finish their term if they wished. Well, many of my cohorts out there decided that jobs were hard to get back home and they might as well finish the 21 months and let the economy improve.
Right.
I said, not being that big a fan of the Army, I'll get out while I can. So I came back home. The Korean War started 3 months later. These troops on Okinawa were the closest U.S. troops to Korea. They did not have combat training, but they were put in as the first U.S. troops into the war in Korea, and most of my friends who stayed there were killed.
Very heavy casualties.
So it was a real break for me and a lucky decision that I made.
Right. So you returned approximately, what was it, February of 1951?
Yeah, that was about it. February 1950.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
February 1950, I think. And I went to work for a consulting engineer in Glenside, Pennsylvania. He was a friend of my mother's, and jobs were hard to get. And I had a little trouble, and he put me to work, and his firm was a sanitary engineering firm, and his business was designing and constructing sewers. So I designed and constructed and inspected sewers for about 6 months or 8 months until I realized that that wasn't really what I wanted to do for a living, that side of engineering wasn't interesting to me. I liked the theoretical side. I still wanted to be a structural engineer, so I decided I would go back to Lehigh for a master's degree in structural engineering.
Pete, one comment about that professional experience you had, plus your professional qualification, permitted you to become a registered professional engineer.
Yes, it did. That was an important part of it.
Important part.
Short as it was.
Right, as short as it was, but important.
Yeah.
When you returned to Lehigh, the opportunities weren't there in structures at that point.
Well, I needed support. I couldn't pay my own tuition, even though it was pretty small in those days. Salaries were small also.
All relative.
That's all relative. I couldn't pay the tuition. I needed a teaching assistantship, and there were none available in structures. They'd all been given out by the time I decided to go back. They said, but we have one in water. Now, you know, I had taken only fluid mechanics when I was in school. I didn't do well in that. We used Hunter Rouse's elementary mechanics of fluids.
Which is written in very tight and beautiful text, but hard to work from.
If I close my eyes, I can still smell the characteristic smell of those glossy pages on which it was printed, because I spent such long hours in that book. And every line, if I look back at it now, I still have it, every line is underlined. I didn't know which was important and which wasn't. I underlined.
Everything in Rouse's book was important. Every word.
But anyway, to pay my way, I took this teaching assistantship in the hydraulics part of the Fritz Laboratory at Lehigh. And while my studies were primarily in structural engineering, some of it was in water, and my teaching obligations were in water. And
Now, you mentioned teaching obligations. As part of the way you did things, you worked as an instructor?
teaching assistant, I think, was what they
Okay.
called us. They paid us the grand sum of $100 a month, for
Right.
which I taught, and I'm not sure now whether it was 5 or 6, because we had Saturday classes, and it may have been 6 laboratories a week. These were 2.5 to 3 hour laboratories. I don't remember that either.
But that was a long time.
Yes, and there were a lot of lab reports to grade every week. Now, I was really, it was the blind leading the blind, because I didn't know what I was doing. And fortunately, I had some colleagues. I had 2 graduate student colleagues. First, there was Ron Neese, who you know. He's been a colleague of yours for many years.
Good mutual friend.
Yes, he
A
is.
stunning friend.
He was there when I arrived at Lehigh, because he had started the year prior. And I would describe him as a theoretician at that time, a scholar certainly, and a sports fanatic like myself, so the 2 of us hit it off very well. And our wives hit it off well. They were both from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, so they had things in common as well. So we had a great time together, and he helped me immensely. He would show me how to do the labs, and then I would turn around and show the students how to do it.
Hasn't changed
No.
much today. He showed me how to do things like this when my first years in teaching, very graciously, gently, kindly, but I think he has that talent there. He's one of the finest teachers I've ever met.
Yes, he is. He's a very good teacher. He's good in the classroom, and he's very good one-on-one. And we had another colleague, Jack Williams, who was a very practically oriented guy, and he, while Ron went on to an academic career at first at Rutgers and then at MIT as a graduate student, and then out to the University of Washington, Jack went into the practice of engineering and developed his own business of some kind. I'm not quite sure what it
Right.
was.
But there's something very special about Jack and another great love of yours.
Oh yes, I forgot about that. Jack was an avid fisherman, and he knew all the good trout streams in that part of Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, nearby New Jersey, and he showed me how to fly fish. And there's quite an art to that. We spent the early times up in the trees trying to retrieve my leaders and flies, but he was really good. We had a lot of fun together. And we had a professor there named Murray McPherson. He was the only one in hydraulics. And Murray was a very hard-working chap, and he would go off 2 or 3 nights a week by train from Bethlehem to New York City.
How long a journey was that?
That must have been about an hour and a half.
Okay.
Go to a night class there at Columbia, given by Boris Bakhmetev,
One of the great
Russian
mechanicians.
immigrant who was a great hydraulician, a free surface flow person primarily, wrote a very good book on free surface flow. And then he would come back that same night in the wee hours of the morning, and the next day would give us the lecture. And so he was an intermediary. I studied under Bakhmetev by proxy.
Right, but he showed a lot of initiative doing
Sure
that
did.
because the normal modes of transmitting knowledge at that stage were very different from now.
And when Murray left academe, which he did some years later, he went on to work for the American Society of Civil Engineers and directed their urban hydrology program for many years.
Which was a very significant contribution and influenced a lot about how things were done in urban hydrology in those years.
We had to do a master's thesis at Lehigh. The theses there could be of a very practical nature, and most of them were. The kinds of things that were done in the laboratory were mainly model studies. The Pennsylvania State Department of Forests and Waters was busy then building a lot of small dams throughout the state, and we were lucky to get many of the model studies of the spillways for these dams.
Right.
And for various reasons, the spillway of one dam, the name of it escapes me after all these years, was curved. So
Curved in the longitudinal direction, plan
curved
view.
in plan view.
Right.
That's right. So of course, the flow down the face of the spillway was supercritical, and when you curve the outer wall into the flow, you get a shock wave.
Marvelous shock waves.
And
Some cavitation too?
I suppose there was, not in the model, but
Okay.
there probably was in the prototype. This took me to the literature where I uncovered the classic, beautiful paper by Arthur Ippen on supercritical flow in open channels, which was his PhD thesis, I believe, under Theodore von Karman at Caltech.
At Caltech, with that famous group there at the time.
Yeah, that's right. He had been at Lehigh, incidentally, as a professor until just before I arrived as a student, when he left Lehigh to go to MIT. But anyway, I found this paper of his, and I applied that to the design of this spillway in an attempt to use curvature and super elevation to cancel some of the shock waves, with limited success, of course, because when the flow changed, they didn't cancel anymore.
Right.
So it was an attempt to do it on an average basis in some way. But it was a lot of fun, and it was a great excitement for me to play with that water and to see what you could do. And I think that's when my interest in water was really sealed.
There's something you've been working on Ippen's work, or you've been using some of his ideas and applying it. How did you first meet Ippen?
Well, I have to step back a little bit because there's something I forgot to tell you. Within a month, or within a couple of weeks after I started at Lehigh for my master's degree, I was recalled to active duty. The Korean War was on, as I said.
Mm-hmm.
And I was recalled to active duty because the Chinese had entered the war. Things were going badly for the U.S., for the United Nations troops, I should say. And the U.S. needed more people in a hurry, so I was recalled to active duty. But fortunately, since I was in graduate school, I was able to get delays in that call for 6 months at a time. Theoretically, as one 6-month delay expired, I would reapply, and it would be extended for another 6 months until I finished my degree.
Right.
Well, at this time, when the Chinese entered the war, my application for a second delay in call was rejected. And I withdrew from the university. I packed my bags. I was assigned to Camp Campbell, Kentucky for airborne troops. I was supposed to either jump out of airplanes or ride in gliders. I don't know whether that was my choice or someone else's choice. And I was all set the alarm to get up in the morning and drive to Fort Meade, Maryland for my reinduction when the telephone rang at 3 in the morning. And it was Fort Meade, Maryland calling to say my application for renewal of my delay had been granted. I had a stay of execution. I could re-enter Lehigh and finish my master's degree. But the problem was, when I finished...
Why 3 in the morning? Was someone actually working at that hour of the night, or they
they had a change of heart.
Just showing you how
the gods were
eager they
watching
were?
over me at that hour. I think they were doing their work. The gods never sleep. So the war was still going on when I graduated, and it was either go to Korea and jump out of airplanes, or go on for a PhD. And that's how careers sometimes get decided.
Right.
I don't think, it's hard, I can't remember. I'm not sure whether I would have gone on for the PhD had that war situation not been there or not. But anyway, that's what drove me to do it. And at that moment, Arthur Ippen walked into the laboratory one day. And he was there because MIT had built him a big new laboratory. In fact, they brought him there to direct this big new laboratory that they had on drawing boards. And he needed, the federal government was sponsoring research suddenly, and they needed graduate students. So he was looking for warm bodies with a good head.
Here is one of the giants of the profession. The group that he'd been with at Caltech included Knapp, Vanoni, Rouse, and there's a famous picture in one of Rouse's History of Hydraulics books showing that group around a flume there, and you just look at the talent and power there. But Art was one of the giants by any measure. So he walked into the lab, and you were doing something at that time.
I was sitting at a drafting table designing a new sewer system for the campus. I was earning extra money to do that, by doing that.
See, that's the benefit of that early professional training.
That's the benefit of that early experience, that's right. And, well, we hit it off right away. Art was a very engaging man, great personality, and he didn't have to sell too hard. And apparently he liked the cut of my jib because next thing I knew, I was off to MIT, which was in January of 1952.
Now here's someone who's a giant, and you're a young person in the profession. How did he introduce himself when you first met him?
Well, as I remember, he walked into the room, stuck out his hand and said, hello. He said, I'm Art Ippen. And that's the way he operated. And I'm sure you can appreciate that it was many years after I got my PhD and came onto the faculty at MIT before I was able to call him Art.
Exactly.
And finally, he had to sit me down one day
And say,
and give me a little lecture about
My
that.
name is Art.
That's right.
I've been there with other
Sure.
colleagues there. Okay, so Art had this truly
I have a
significant...
picture of him, Steve.
Yeah,
You're going to show that later?
And I think we'll
All right.
definitely include that
Okay.
because it's very, very special. He influenced very, very heavily at that point.
Yeah, he was not only my mentor and supervisor, he was a surrogate father.
You refer to Art as almost a surrogate father. In many ways, he's more of an adoptive father.
I think that's
in that he recognized some very high talent in somebody, and you had a very special relationship there.
Yes, I did.
The other part there, given this new lab and very large number of projects that were coming and pouring in there to this very special facility, he clearly needed doctoral student colleagues to be having a go at things there, and just comment on a few of the others who came in at this stage.
Well, one in particular that I think you would like me to talk about was Ron Neese. Art came to me and said, were there any other people there at Lehigh with you that you think might be interested in going on for the PhD and be qualified? And I said, definitely Ron Neese. He had gone on to be an instructor at Rutgers. And so I contacted Ron, and he came up and liked what he saw and made the switch, came from Rutgers up to MIT and began as a graduate student with me. In fact, we shared an office cubicle for several years.
And told lots of stories.
Told lots of stories to each other. He continued to help me, continued to teach me, and we had a sign up over the door, said go, 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 which was our continual goad to keep driving.
Keep pushing.
Keep pushing, which we did.
And I can vouch for you pushing and Ron pushing right till today.
And I was going to tell you about my doctoral work.
Yeah, okay.
Which was a problem dealing with the sorting of bottom sediments by water waves which were shoaling, that is, coming up to breaking on a beach. It took me about 2 years to build the experimental equipment, including a hydraulic servo mechanism, in which I learned a lot about hydraulic machinery, that kind of hydraulic machinery. And after 2 years building it, I found the most important piece of information in the first half hour of experimentation with it. So it's funny how those things work out. But I felt inadequate in that project because here was a problem with sediment moving in the bottom boundary layer, which is a difficult problem even in steady motion.
Very hard problem.
This was an oscillating boundary layer driven by very nonlinear water waves. So the mathematics of the problem were just incomprehensible to me, and I think would have defeated almost anyone.
And we didn't have adequate computers.
We didn't have the computers at that time, no. They didn't come in until shortly later, and I'll tell you about that. But there was an MIT ethic at that time, it's still there, which was that you were supposed to find, or at least try, to find a theoretical physical basis for your experimental observations, and then present both the theory and the experiment as your report of your work. And I was working on problems which were more than I could handle with the mathematics and the physics. I just didn't have the background.
Which was very typical of the education at that time. Those weren't emphasized as much, the physics, the mathematics, the more detailed mechanics, and that's just the reality of those times, but you recognize something important about it.
I always felt that I should have been educated as an earth scientist to be doing the kind of research that I was doing.
Right.
I became an instructor then in 1954 and an assistant professor in 1955 and got my doctorate in June of 1956.
Right.
And during those graduate years, my 3 children were born, Helen, Peter Jr., and Jeffrey, and I'm going to come back to them later and tell you a little bit more about them.
Okay. Pete, if we look at some of the things you've achieved over the years, and one of the important things to any of us in academia are our academic children, and in many instances here we could talk about our undergraduate student colleagues, our graduate student colleagues, but let's just restrict it to some doctoral colleagues. And over a 30-year span, just mention maybe the first and the last in there, and perhaps possibly one of the things that was a bit unusual that people who know you as as an earth scientist hydrologist may not have thought about.
Well, yeah, that's fine. There were, I think, 14 of the doctoral students over those 30 years. The first one was Gerrit Tobis. Gerrit came from Holland via Indonesia. He grew up as a child in Indonesia where his parents were working, and he was interned by the Japanese in a camp during World War II. Following World War II, he went back to Holland, and I understand that he finished his whole high school work in 1 year, something
Right.
like that. Is that right?
That's right.
And then he came over to MIT and worked with me on a problem which involved the effect of the trailing edge geometry of thin, flat plates immersed in high-velocity fluid flow on their hydroelastic vibration. This was a project supported by the Navy, and their interest was in underwater noise.
Right.
They wanted to quiet submarines
Right.
and other things. And so anytime a vane is submerged in high-speed flow, the vortexes shedding in the wake will force the structure to move, and the motion of the structure augments the vortex, which augments the force, and it can get quite large amplitude vibration. So that's what we were studying, a far cry from civil engineering, you might think. And this led, theoretical, trying to follow the MIT ethic, this led to a formulation, analytical formulation of the problem, which is classified as van der Poel's equation, a highly nonlinear partial differential equation which was beyond our ability to solve, theoretically.
Right.
So we had to resort to experiment. The last of these 14 students is Dara Entakabi, who's now a tenured associate professor at MIT. And his thesis problem was land surface hydrology parameterization for general circulation models. That was in 1989. Now you asked for an interesting one in between, and I think I'd have to pick the thesis of Frank Perkins. This was a project supported by the Omaha division of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And it had to do with hydropower plant transients. The Corps of Engineers was then building a lot of big dams on the Missouri River. Among them, Garrison Dam and Oahe Dam. And what our job was to do a comprehensive field test on the Garrison Dam, which had been completed, testing the penstocks, the surge tanks, for pressure rises on change of load, for surge, adequacy of the surge tank to relieve these pressures,
Right.
and check the response of the system to variable load as well. So the Waterways Experiment Station people at Vicksburg were the ones responsible for doing the instrumentation and conducting the tests. But Frank Perkins and I and Art Ippen and others on the project got to go and walk through the dewatered penstocks and climb up the towers and look into the surge tanks and watch the installation of the pressure gauges and the velocity instruments and so on. And then when they fired it up again a little bit later on, we were there for the test. And we had the most unusual experience and opportunity, which was to take the control mechanism, the feedback mechanism, the governor mechanism of the turbine generator, and oscillate it with our fingers in order to make the wicket gates of the turbine open and close rhythmically,
Right.
in order to excite a rhythmic oscillation, just the thing you normally try to avoid
Exactly.
in this huge mass of water, that water column in the penstock and the riser of the surge tank. And then while someone was doing that, we got to climb up again on the surge tank tower and look down in and see this tremendous column of water rushing up toward us and then falling back away from us. It was one of the most exciting times of my life to see.
You hoped that the water didn't come to the full height of the right.
The purpose of the experiments was to gather, because they had done some unusual things in the design of the penstocks and the surge tanks, was to gather information on head loss and things that would be useful in the design of the Oahe system, which was still on the drawing boards.
Right.
But Frank was my second student, and he went on to come onto the MIT faculty, be a department head in civil engineering, and then to be dean of the graduate school. He's now retired.
Right. Let's pick up on Frank for a moment. First time I met you was in November of 1973 when I visited MIT, and I met Frank on that occasion too there, and I was chatting with Frank, and he said, now there's one thing Pete loves. He loves the mathematical formulation involving the physics and getting the mathematics right. It's something he really loves, and I think that comes through in quite a lot of your work over the years. But the other thing that Frank picked up on, and all of us who've known you, is the drive to do something and do it well and commitment to do it. But I want to go back just briefly to Geratobus. We have a common friend here, in that I got to know him starting in 1974 when we were both interested in systems application in civil engineering, water resource systems engineering, and he was absolutely inspirational. He died in 1981 of pancreatic cancer, and in June of 1981 he came along to a conference when he knew he was dying, and he sat there like the best of graduate student colleague friends, and I spent precious time with him there, and very soon thereafter he died, but he made it as a way of saying goodbye to some of his colleagues. And he called you just before he died.
He called me from his hospital bed just a couple of days before he died to say goodbye. It was remarkable.
Truly a remarkable man. In looking at some of these other parts of work here, you've indicated this with your doctoral work and then some of the work that Garrett was doing. You weren't necessarily comfortable with your formal background, and there's some other things that come into play here. There are several things that come in that, and Ardipan suggesting some things to you and so forth. Do you want to follow up on that?
Well, in the early 60s, I was told, or it was intimated to me, that I ought to look at my career progress a little bit, because I was trying to do too much. Baseball was still bugging me, and I was the faculty advisor to the MIT baseball team, and I would go out a couple times a week and work out with the team and do things like that, which my department had frowned upon and didn't think should be on my career path. And I was traveling around the country, talking to high schools, trying to interest kids in coming to MIT, and I guess I wasn't devoting enough time to the MIT ethic, and it was showing. So. At that time, Gordon Brown, who had been the head of the electrical engineering department at MIT, became dean of engineering, and he had a mandate for engineering science, changing engineering education at MIT and consequently in the country from an empirical business to engineering science. He used as his example electrical engineering's experience. He said, look, his favorite story was, take an undergraduate at MIT. He enters MIT for a 4-year curriculum, and the vacuum tube is the primary ingredient of his circuits. During his student years, the vacuum tube goes out, the transistor comes in, the transistor goes out, and the printed circuit comes in. He said, you can't teach state-of-the-art because they'll be obsolete upon graduation. You have to teach fundamental science. Right. And let them roll with the punches and lead. And the one thing he didn't understand was that progress in technology wasn't as rapid in all fields of engineering, and he tried to put this imprint, which was successful in electrical engineering, onto all the departments in the school. So what I was feeling from my department head was the pressure that he was getting from the dean to make civil engineering an engineering science department. And Ardipan said to me at that time, look, Pete, he said, I think maybe you have a good opportunity here to bring modern science to what was then the empirical field of engineering hydrology. Do you want to give it a try?
And you took up the challenge.
Oh, I took up the challenge because I thought that anybody could leave tracks in fresh snow, and I was anxious to leave some tracks because I wanted to have a career at MIT by this time.
The one thing about Gordon Brown picking up there, that was a time of very dramatic change. There'd been Sputnik, there'd been the maser, the laser, the printed circuit came on. It would be hard not to get caught up in that kind of an approach and understand that. But at this stage, there's something else came into play that you elected to do something about this under an opportunity.
Well, yeah, first of all, if I was going to teach hydrology and make that my career, I had to learn about it because I didn't know anything about hydrology. So I started an intensive reading campaign, and because of my previous dissatisfaction with my background, and because of my interest in the fundamentals, I wanted to make this, found the field, if I was going to make a change in it, make this change in the direction of geoscience, to try and get geoscience, meteorology, oceanography, the background of that material, which was relevant to hydrology, well fixed in my mind.
Right.
So I had some faculty advisors there, friends in other departments, Jim Austin in meteorology, Hank Painter in mechanical engineering, who helped me wade my way through respective literatures and learn some of the things I needed to know. I began assembling material, assembling my own understanding into a book. That was kind of an ambitious thing. I chose as my models, ambitiously, two books that I had read. One, Proudman's Dynamical Oceanography, and the other one, Horowitz's Dynamic Meteorology. And I was taken, again, still captured by the Journal of Fluid Mechanics mode of an elegant mathematical solution,
right,
and then experimental points that either did or did not verify that. And those books were written in that mode, with elegant mathematical development of those nice, clean sciences of oceanography and meteorology. I wanted to do the same thing with hydrology, if I could. So I called this book Dynamic Hydrology, and that's the book that was ultimately published in 1970 by McGraw-Hill. But I had a long way to go yet before I finished it. And I think to show you what I was trying to do, maybe I'll read from the preface,
I
the
think
first
it's
paragraph or so.
because it's showing the setting at the time and how you saw it at the time. I think it's important.
Okay. This is the preface to Dynamic Hydrology. Forecasts of the natural occurrence and movement of water are central elements in the solution of many agricultural and environmental problems. Because of the large scale and abundant heterogeneity of the physical systems involved, it seems clear that this forecasting must have both probabilistic and deterministic elements, which vary in their relative importance from problem to problem. It also appears likely that growth of our observational and computational capabilities will, through their revelation of natural order, provide a continuing growth in the signal-to-noise ratio of these forecasts. It's my conviction, therefore, that the most useful solution to these problems are to be found through analyses and syntheses which seek to take full account of the deterministic aspects of the dynamic phenomena involved. Accordingly, in this volume, I've tried to present a summary of the principal physical processes of interest to the engineering hydrologist. I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, fair enough. About that stage, you getting ready to do the book and influencing your background reading, and you took a year with no teaching duties, but all the other academic duties, and did other reading and sat in on courses. What were
That's
you
right.
picking up on that?
Well, Gordon Brown was very kind and had great foresight. He turned me loose from the teaching responsibilities, as you said, on what you might call an internal sabbatical. And I took courses in electrical engineering largely, probability and statistics, which I had not been exposed to before, linear and nonlinear systems, statistical theory of communications, Norbert Wiener's work, and the analysis and design of engineering systems. That latter course was taught in mechanical engineering. All the others were taught in electrical engineering.
The interesting part out of this, though, Pete, the first paper that you published away from fluid mechanics and in hydrology was in the journal Water Resources Research in 1966, and it was with Bill Shack, and it's entitled Some Criteria for the Measurement of Rainfall and Runoff. And the abstract tells a very important story. Techniques of linear analysis are used to study urban and rural drainage basins as low-pass filters. The frequency passband of the basin is determined in terms of its physical characteristics. This determination is used in conjunction with the spectral representation of input rainfall to investigate the necessary response characteristics of rainfall and runoff measuring instruments. That learning is absolutely demonstrated in that paper.
It comes through clear, loud and clear, doesn't it?
It really comes through in a very special way. Just after that, 1966 was that paper, and the only opportunity you'd had to teach yourself for that is under normal academic duties, but without formal classroom duties, so all those pressures. Then there came an opportunity for a sabbatical leave
Yeah, the MIT pressures are quite intense, as I'm sure
They're huge.
You realize. And it was really a wonderful opportunity to get away on sabbatical. I chose deliberately to go as far away from MIT as I could. And Canberra, Australia is just about antipodal. So I had
further places.
I had an opportunity to go, an invitation from the CSIRO, from Tom Chapman, to go out there to apply for a Fulbright fellowship, to go out and work with them. I did that and got the fellowship, and this was the first time, really, that we had a chance, my wife and the 3 kids, to be together as a family because of the MIT pressures.
Was Tom then at the Duntroon Military College or physically with CSIRO?
No, he was physically with CSIRO in the division, what was then the Division of Land Research.
Oh, and then moved to Duntroon.
And after that, he moved to Duntroon.
Got it.
So we chose to travel by sea. I guess this is an outgrowth of my cattleman's years. And we traveled by sea from Fort Lauderdale, Florida to Sydney. And it was a devious route, a passenger ship. It took 6 weeks. And we had a blast. It was a marvelous experience. And who should be waiting for me on dockside when the ship pulled into Sydney Harbor but Jim Doog, standing there to greet me as I stepped off the ship. He was there for a conference was going on at the University of New South Wales at the
And you'd first met him in 1964?
In the back of a bus in what was then Leningrad.
Right.
And we struck up a friendship. I had worshipped him from afar, having read his classic paper on linear hydrologic systems, and wished I could write a paper like that. That's the kind of thing I wanted to do in hydrology, and to meet him was really a great experience for me. And we struck up a friendship which has grown and mellowed with the years and is still strong today.
Jim inspires lots of us.
Yes, he does.
A great guy.
Yes, he does.
So you're free of the normal academic responsibilities,
Yeah.
and a chance to think, some field experience, work on your book.
Oh yeah, and then we learned the whole family learned to play tennis over there. My boys learned to play cricket and Aussie rules football.
now, a real game.
Oh yeah, we had a great time with the outdoors life of Australia and did a lot of fishing. So it was wonderful. Saw new birds and animals. And as you say, this was my first experience with field observations in hydrology. We were working on arid catchments outside of Alice Springs. I mean, out where the road, not only where the paved road ends, or where the ruts end, but where the track ends. We were off beyond that. So it was
Did you find the mythical black stump?
No, we didn't find the mythical black stuff.
Okay.
So it was a very productive time for me. And an interesting thing happened. One of the early days I was there, I went to a symposium in that lovely Australian Academy building there in Canberra, that dome-shaped auditorium.
Right.
And I happened to sit next to Neil Boddy of the Australian Meteorological Service, or Bureau. And something a speaker was saying prompted Neil to say to me, you know, I've found by experience that almost irrespective of catchment size, it takes only about 2 rain gauges to get all the information you need for long-term average, spatial time average precipitation on a catchment. He said, why is that? And he had me then, but I thought I must be able to get at it through the sampling theorem and the spectral analysis of the input signal, having been taught all this stuff back at MIT. So that's what I set out to do right away, and this ultimately ended up in the paper on the rainfall network design, where sure enough, it turned out that 2 was a sufficient number, more or less.
I want to pick up on that paper, Pete. This was published in Water Resources Research in 1967, and Optimal Design of Rainfall Networks, single author, abstract. Techniques of harmonic analysis, again reflecting this background, and the concepts of distributed linear systems, Jim Doog, are used to study the sensitivity of peak catchment discharge to the characteristic spatial variability of convective and cyclonic storm rainfall. Very important topics. Skip down a little. Specification of network density for the study of long-term catchment average rainfall is accomplished by considering the long-term point rainfall as a homogeneous random variable to be sampled spatially. which comes in to influence a lot of your later work, I think. And a little later down in the abstract, in many studies, little advantage is gained by utilizing more than 2 properly located stations for the determination of the long-term aerial mean rainfall, as opposed to the shorter term for the flood response.
Right.
And this was truly a landmark paper. So Neil had some influence.
Oh, Neil did have some influence, and I was really happy to be able to send him a copy of that paper and thank him for putting me on that track.
Someone else that, there are other people that you were around at that stage. I think at that stage you first rubbed shoulders a bit with John Phillip, and more so in later years.
Yeah, I did. My first contact with John Phillip was when my wife and I went to his house for supper, and I spilled a glass of beer on his sofa. Oh, and I was scared to death because John was an icon also, you know.
You're right. This would have gone over. But now, did he rush down and lap it up?
Oh no, he ran off and got me another beer.
Somebody else you also met there was Robin Wooding.
Yeah, Robin Wooding, as you well know, was a New Zealander who then was working for CSIRO in Australia on some kind of, I think maybe he was immigrating to Australia, but he went back ultimately to New Zealand. And he had just finished what was called the catchment stream problem. That is, he'd applied the kinematic wave model of runoff, surface runoff, to a simple catchment stream like an open book, where the spine of the book would be the stream and the hill slopes would be the pages.
But he did that in New Zealand, if I
I think he
right.
did it in New Zealand, but it was just published at that time,
Right,
in
but
1966.
I think that work was done when he was working with Frank Henderson, who
Yeah, it was.
still in New Zealand
It
at
was,
that
because
stage.
Henderson had done a lot with the kinematic wave
Okay.
prior to that.
Okay.
And, but I wasn't aware of it because it was just coming into print then. So he introduced me to it and led me through it and showed me what he was doing. And, you know, as you well know better than I, the kinematic wave isn't a good model for hill slope runoff, but you know, it can be passable for the flow in a stream.
Excellent for flow and stream.
And as long as the lateral inflow from the hill slope is continuous, you can get a decent representation of the combined behavior of the hill slope and channel by the application of this model of Wooding's. So that's what I tried to do. I'm going to talk about it a little later in more detail, but I used it as the transformation function in order to derive the distribution of peak stream flow. That is, the inputs to the catchment stream problem were precipitation, and if I had their distributions, I could convert those distributions of precipitation into the distribution of peak stream flow using the catchment stream model as the transforming function.
One thing about that, you're also doing work on your book and bringing that to completion, and that was an important part there. And I remember several years ago, you and I were chatting about the book, and you made the comment that, well, it's not necessarily a good book, and I stopped you in your tracks in the street of San Francisco and said, it is, Pete. But and it only had just dawned on me a year or so beforehand, that what you need to study the subject is to study it at least 3 times, with perhaps 3 perspectives. Once using something like a Lindsley, Kohler, and Paulus book, another is using a Dunn and Leopold type book, and then you know enough to appreciate the approach that you brought forth in your book. A truly, truly important way to do that, and I've shared that with other people since, and they've all come to realize about the same thing there. So it turned out to be a very good book.
Well, I never intended it to be an undergraduate text, that's clear, and it certainly didn't turn out to be that, and I'm not sure it's a good graduate text either, but maybe used, as you have pointed out, it could be. It's, of course, full of mistakes, which I see clearly now and didn't then. But I think it did have some effect. And I did spend a lot of time in Australia and essentially finished the manuscript there. And I think books are important for we academics to leave behind us for the students, because we can have an enormous effect that way.
I want to pick up on that. There was, the universities are rated by one of the news magazines, U.S. News and World Report, and there are all kinds of people griping university administration, sort of saying, we don't like the way you did it, it's crazy. Perhaps in 20 years' time that magazine won't be around, but be as it may, they rate universities. And on an occasion back in 1995, they had ranked your home department at MIT #1. And for whatever reasons, people asked you, as the resident poet laureate at that stage actually, would you put together some appropriate verse? And I'd like you to share with us the verse that you put together with respect to that, because the very important comment you have about books in that penultimate verse there.
Yeah, well, the people, the staff and department headquarters had been anxious to congratulate Raphael Bras, the department head, for an extraordinary performance in bringing the department to this #1 rating. So they organized a little celebratory party one Friday afternoon, and they asked me, actually, it's Poet Laureate Emeritus, because I was retired at the stage. They asked me, since I like to do this kind of doggerel, would I write a little commemorative verse? And I thought this is a time to leave a little lesson. So I'll read this. It's entitled, with apologies now to a poet whose name escapes me. Years make me forget names, but you'll recognize it perhaps. High on a peak in Cambridge. We've gathered in great celebration to give Rafa congratulation. Obtaining the rating for which he's been waiting on his watch brings gratification. U.S. News says, quote, the best game in town. Science Digest says the same thing of Brown. Let's temper our pride, since we know deep inside that tomorrow it could all turn around. That's the problem with all this renown. Heavy's the head wears a U.S. News crown. For now we are golden, but to Galileo beholden, for what once goes up must come down. It's great to be held in esteem. It all seems like part of a dream. I hold it's not treason to search for the reason. Can we say it's because we're a team? Contrary to common perception, it's not teaching or research that I mention. It's writing the books that produce the new looks that captures our colleagues' attention. So if we're to stay at the top for more than a very brief stop, we'll make a requirement for books on environment and watch our competitors drop.
Absolutely key. Reread the last two lines of the penultimate verse.
It's writing the books that produce the new looks that captures our colleagues' attention.
Right. We come now to a fairly major change.
Fairly major. Yeah. 1967, 68, back to MIT. And I got back to MIT and found that my office was moved next to the department head's office. And I began finding the department head, who was Charles Miller, asking me to do things which kind of set me in opposition to my mentor, Art Ippen, who was over across campus in his laboratory. Charlie was asking me to help develop plans for a water resources component to the effort in the department to complement, and perhaps you might say counterbalance, that of the hydrodynamics group, which Ippen was directing and through which I had grown up. So I made some recommendations to him. I recommended that he hire two people, one in water resource systems, and that was John Shockey, who had just finished his PhD at Johns Hopkins, where we sit today. Right. And the other one was in applied probability, and that was Ignacio Rodriguez Iturbe, a giant in the field, recommended to me out of Colorado State University by both Vujica Jevđević and David Doughty. So they both came onto the faculty. And the first thing I knew in 1969, I was asked to become the department head myself. Had I been smarter, I might have seen it coming, but I didn't. But I didn't. It was a surprise to me, really. And my mentor, Art Ippen, cautioned me against that. He said, you're going like gangbusters with the hydrology, and you're going to have it in the palm of your hands shortly, he said, so why leave it now? But I'm always interested in a new challenge, and can I do it? And so I said yes. And I sat down and gave a lot of thought to what it was that we ought to be doing, in my view anyway, and this I had already done for Charlie. And I felt that the problems that society was asking civil engineers to solve, that is the provision of the kind of infrastructure that it needed, were not going to be solved by more and higher technology. It didn't seem that that's where the frontier was to do a better job. Mm-hmm. that frontier lay with learning how to handle the externalities, the social and economical and political issues that conflicted on the doing of engineering work. And that we ought to find a way to bring people conversant with those problems into the classroom to interact with our students. And we ought to do some, at least, research, quote, project-type studies involving those issues so that undergraduate and graduate students could have some real-life experience in working on problems like that. So, in opposition to lots of people within the department, I went ahead and hired, since department heads have a lot of power in that system.
As opposed to department chairman.
As opposed to department chairmen who are really committee chairmen.
Right.
I hired a water economist, a transportation economist, an environmental lawyer, another systems analyst, and a political scientist onto the faculty as assistant professors in civil engineering. I was very naive about, well, I had thought about it, but didn't truly appreciate the depth of difficulty that I would encounter with other department heads in other schools at MIT. We have a world-class Department of Economics at MIT, famous for turning out Nobel Prize winners. Mm-hmm. We have a pretty good Department of Political Science. We don't have a law school, so that wasn't a problem. But at least from political science and from economics, I got a lot of static for appointing people in their fields without having their stamp of approval.
They didn't see them as being potential Nobel workers for the work they were choosing
They did
to
not.
do.
They thought that the kind of economics and political science that they would be doing with us was pedestrian, to use their words, and not the kind of thing they would give a person a faculty appointment, let alone tenure, to do within their departments.
Absolutely crucial to improving civil engineering.
Crucial to improving civil engineering. So I tried to override them. I had the ear of the provost and was able to get the appointments made over their objections, which didn't help me further down the line. But when it came time for tenure, of course, then the other schools had to cast their vote for these people, and I was clearly a loser. And it was a very frustrating time. I gave my all. Long hours and much emotional energy, and as well as intellectual energy to the problem, but I failed. I didn't carry the day, and it was a very difficult time for me. I was not able to do much research. I wrote only one paper during that time, and it was the one the one I referred to earlier about the dynamics of flood frequency. And did you have some question you wanted to ask about that?
Just a little later I might pick up on that if you want to keep going on there.
Yeah, well, what I did, I think I've already told you, was to use the kinematic wave model that Wooding had developed as a transforming function to derive the output distribution of the catchment, the distribution of flood peak discharge from the input distributions of the precipitation variables. And this put the flood frequency curve in terms of parameters of the input distributions and the catchment geomorphology.
Pick up on that, Pete. When this paper came out, I had been at the University of Washington just 2 years, young assistant professor. Pete Eagleson's written a paper, I better read this. So it came out in August of 1972 called The Dynamics of Flood Frequency. I thought, wow, this will help me. And I waded through all 136 equations, and it's absolutely vintage Eagleson, okay, for precision, way the problem's handled, cut through the dross. But the one part in the abstract I think sums up quite a few features. It provides a theoretical basis for estimating flood frequency in the absence of streamflow records and for extrapolating empirical estimates based on short records. Because of the explicit appearance of physically meaningful catchment parameters, it also allows quantitative estimates of the effect of flood frequency of changes in average land use. And that's something we've always needed to go. It gave people a lot to think about. It hasn't got the answers necessarily, it's got a lot, but it gave people things to think about, and that's a very important part there. But I think all of us looked at the time and said, this is pretty impressive for a guy who's running a major department to be able to turn out a paper of this nature. And if I remember correctly, you had an undergraduate colleague help with some of the computations in this. Maybe you've forgotten that. But
Boy, I think I have. The other one, the one about the instruments, Bill Shack was an undergraduate in mechanical engineering,
Right.
doing that one, and I've forgotten here who it was. Tell me who it was. Do you know?
I think I talked to you once about that, and you said someone helped you with that. That might even
I'm
be
sure that's
knowledge.
true. If I told you that, that's true.
But back to the department head years, and the group you set up was truly reflective of what the needs of the profession, training people for the profession, for the complex systems type problems people faced. And there are two other groups in the country. Well, before that, there was the Harvard Water Program that that had quite a few of these elements and showed a lot of how to put together, and that was a brilliant combination of people. But Ray Lindsley, Clark Oglesby, and Perry McCarty at Stanford had put together a program on engineering economic planning. They recognized this too, so they worked with a distinguished political scientist. They worked with people in economics, and they just tried this whole approach. But when Ray left Stanford in 1974, the program didn't last much longer. It was based on very strong people, and that was the case there. But the one surviving group that comes close here is here on this campus right now, Department of Geography and Environmental Engineering, and our mutual friend and colleague Reg Wallman, and the things that they got to do in the mix of economics, policy, systems, real science is well included, all these things combined there. It's very hard to put together that kind of a group to do the things that really are needed in society, and this is something academic administrations, I don't think, have quite come to understand.
Yeah, well, the walls around the departments at MIT are quite impermeable, high and impermeable, and they were a barrier to doing this, although there are new attempts arising just today to go back and revisit this issue.
Right.
So I hope they have more success than I did, but it was a very difficult time for me, both professionally and personally. My marriage dissolved during this period of time, and I was not happy with the way the work was going as department head. And in 1974, then, I married Beverly, whom you know. She was my high school sweetheart many years prior to that.
Very precious.
And she certainly is. And she was a school psychologist. And after she moved to Boston, went to work in Lexington High School as their school psychologist. She brought 4 children of her own to the marriage, so we had 7 children, never all together in the same house.
Right. That gives you plenty to think about.
Indeed it does. You'll hear more about them later, I think. And in 1975, I resigned as department head. I solved that problem by getting out. I realized that whatever quirk of my makeup, I wasn't able to get personal satisfaction out of fulfilling the department head's job of assuring the success of his faculty. That is, you're supposed to see to it that your faculty has what they need to succeed.
Right.
And even at the expense of your own ability to do things for yourself. And maybe it's selfishness on my part, but I wasn't able to get the kind of personal satisfaction from that role that I needed to be happy professionally.
So it's time for change.
Time to get out, which I did.
I remember talking to Dave Marks sometime after that, and he said, Pete's an example of someone who's come back from the dead. And that was the comment. Anyone who'd gone into this demanding administrative role, how hard it is to get back and take an active leadership, scientific leadership role again that doesn't have an administrative flavor. But the plus came out of this, I think, as again your determination to do things. You teamed up with Bev, and then you headed off to Caltech for a sabbatical in 1975.
Marvelous year. That was a determining year in my life, really, which turned me around professionally and, of course, personally, because I was in a new marriage. I was a guest of Norman Brooks at Caltech, working in the Keck laboratory, the famous Keck laboratory, and this was the second really productive year. I find that when I'm relieved of the burdens of everyday academic responsibility, you know, the committees and all the other things you have to do, that my creative juices flow much more freely than when I'm encumbered by those things. So they really flowed at Caltech. I went there with 2 goals. One of them, because at that time there was a long-standing and far-reaching drought in the Sahel region of Africa, if you remember. And there was a lot of debate in the scientific community about the causes for it. People had theories and nobody seemed to know. And I thought I could profitably spend my sabbatical year studying that problem and seeing what I could uncover. That's in the professional direction to get me back into hydrology. And in the other sense, personal sense, I wanted to be sure I could say, I'm through with academic administration. I still thought, well, it would be nice to be college president or a dean.
You thought you could do it?
I wasn't sure. I wanted to put that to rest as well while I was out there. So anyway, I did a lot of reading. I read on climate. I read about the interesting work of Jerome Namias, who was at the Scripps Institute then. He's dead now, unfortunately, who had uncovered observational evidence for correlation between sea surface temperature in the tropical Pacific Ocean and climatic variabilities on the continents of the Western Hemisphere, and he dubbed them teleconnections, and that word has stuck. And I found that fascinating and saw possible application there for forecasting purposes. I read the writings of those involved in large-scale numerical models of climate, principally Larry Gates, who was then employed by the Rand Corporation in California, later went on to Oregon State University. I'm not sure where he is just now. So I set out to formulate the long-term average, I'll call it the climatic water balance, water yield rather, formulate long-term average climatic water yield by deriving the distribution of all the individual terms of the water balance, just as I had done with the floods now.
Right.
I took the basic mechanics of the particular component of the water balance and worked from the atmospheric driving through to get the hydrologic component, whatever it was, whether it was infiltration or runoff, whatever the box of the water balance was. So I got those derived distributions, which I could then get the mean of. So I had the mean of every term in the water balance, which then gave me the mean of the yield by proper addition or subtraction, depending upon what it was. And this had as parameters, of course, the parameters of the input precipitation, the parameters of the soil as far as water flow in the soil was concerned, and the parameters of the vegetation. And it was a terribly exciting time for me. One of the most exciting professionally I've ever had, because every day there was something new. I was learning something new, or I thought I was discovering it. I'm sure it was well known, but to me it was a discovery, and what's the difference? You
Right.
get the same joy from it as if you were the first one.
Right.
And revelations and insights, and it was just, I didn't want the year to end. And I discovered that with the long-term average, I'll call it the climatic soil moisture as the state variable of this water balance equation, that it was sensitive to the amount of vegetation, which appeared parametrically in the model. And if there was more or less vegetation, the soil moisture was more or less. And the fact that there was a peak in the soil moisture at a particular intermediate value of the vegetation density, which got me thinking in a natural selection mode as to, well, what would the vegetation do from an evolutionary point of view put in this situation? And I reasoned that it would arrange itself such that there was as much water available to it as possible, because then not only would it be safest from drought, but it would also be maximally productive, which is probably what it's trying to do. Mm-hmm. And that got me into what I have called ecological optimality, and it's been a subject that has captured my interest ever since, and on which I'm still working.
Pete, on this basis here, what really came forth of that year at Caltech, and this whole new reading and tying together derived distributions, a whole bunch of background, and this new challenge, a famous set of 7 papers. And this also led to your interest in what we would call, for want of a better term, hydroclimatology, and ecological part. But before we do that, I just want to pick up here on the papers that appeared in October 1978 in Water Resources Research. Now, an author today who sent in 7 papers, the editor might say, oh, look, please combine them into 2 without having the wisdom to know what was there, much like John Phillip had submitted either 4 or 5 papers that the editors asked to make into 7 to make them into more readable units at the time. So the great pieces seem to come out in good teeth here. But the the famous set of 7 papers, 400 reprints got doled out on those if I remember correctly. The title was Climate, Soil and Vegetation. And the first paper, part 1, Introduction to Water Balance Dynamics, and then all the other subparts that come out there. But in the abstract here, it says a lot about what's directed your future work as well. A statistical dynamic formulation of the vertical water budget at the land-atmosphere interface, crucial, is outlined. Physically based dynamic and conservative equations express the infiltration, exfiltration, a relatively new term at that time that John Phillip had coined, transpiration, percolation to groundwater, and capillary rise from the water table during rainstorms and interstorm periods in terms of independent variables representing the precipitation, potential evapotranspiration, soil and vegetal properties, and water table elevations. It's all there. Uncertainty is introduced into these equations through the probability density functions of the independent climatic variables and yields derived probability distributions of the dependent water balance elements, surface runoff, evapotranspiration, and groundwater runoff. So you're in the stochastic, uncertain mode, as well as the key of hydrology, which is the water budget.
Right.
So that is a set that really has influenced where you've gone for quite a while.
Yeah, the insights from that are still guiding what I'm doing today.
Right. Now, Pete, on the return from your sabbatical.
Can I interrupt you, Steve?
Well, most
Because
certainly.
There was another thread there that I didn't complete. I had 2 goals, one of which was to settle the issue about whether I wanted to be an academic administrator. Just as I was getting to the end of these papers and was so excited by it, I was approached by an offer to be president of a very prestigious small college. And I didn't hesitate to tell them thank you, but no thank you. It was clear to me what I wanted to do with the rest of my professional life.
And I think a lot of other people have benefited from that choice.
I hope so.
Well, that's my reading of it. The thing now about, one other little part I want to bring in here. I've known you to write poetry on a number of occasions, an appropriate one, and one very sweet piece that you wrote was in honor of Reg Wallman 2 years ago on this campus in a building 50 meters from where we are, on the occasion of the follow-through of the Wallman Symposium that had been held at the AGU meeting. And that was a very special occasion because he's a special colleague, and that was something nice. And now that you've told me a little bit about your dad's influence, suggesting that you read poetry or making sure you read some poetry, I can see where this came. It wasn't obviously to me before that, but you have interest in poetry, you have interest in art, and particularly modern art, and I gather
Bev brought
that to you, and in visiting your home, it's very clear that the modern art theme, it fits, it looks right, it seems right, and that says something very special about the choice and the display. And Bev has a great talent as a decorator.
She has a remarkable talent that way.
As that one. Another interest, given you've been out to Australia, and I don't consider that an exotic culture, we should tell the people if they can't figure out that I was born and raised in Australia. They may have figured that out now, but
They might have.
They might not also. Hence the excitement of cricket and Australian rules when you mentioned that this baseball game is a bit funny still. You and Bev have deep appreciation for classical music, and if you could only listen to 10 minutes of classical music, if you only had 10 minutes that someone said, look, you've only got 10 minutes this day, what would you listen to? What would be your choice?
That's no problem with that choice at all. It would be the 3rd movement of Beethoven's 9th Symphony, the Choral Symphony. I love it.
I think a very fine choice.
It makes me cry.
You're not the only one. It's a special piece. One other part that comes up there, so the visiting of foreign countries, you and Bev like to go and visit places that the cultures are just vastly different. You want to comment any about some even fairly recent experiences doing that?
Well, the most recent experience we had was in Cambodia and Burma, and we went to see Angkor Wat. And there's a similar city, not as grand, similar set of monumental temples in Burma, on a big plain in Burma. We visited that. I've forgotten the name just now. But while we were in Burma, we had the opportunity to go and sit outside the gates of Aung San Suu Kyi's home, where she has been imprisoned by the current government, and heard her give her talk to her followers. She's a marvelous lady and has a captivating personality, and we got to go up and speak with her afterward. That was the highlight of the trip.
Right.
But that wasn't so exotic as some of the other places, like the mountains of New Guinea and some places in Indonesia that we've been.
But the interest is still there, and so on.
Yes.
Now, there's one other part I want to bring in here, that you've talked about interest in baseball and sports and fishing and fly fishing, and your neighbor in Canberra was forever pestering you, so saying, Pete, let's go fishing, let's go fishing.
Oh, yes.
Right.
We went regularly up to the Snowies and fly fished.
Right, but I want to comment just a little bit about baseball. That you're a fanatic. You're an absolute fanatic as a baseball fan. There's no question about that. And I remember you taking him along in Cincinnati in 1984 to see the Reds and the White Sox play. It's the only game I've ever been to, only one ever. I don't need to see another one. I have never seen anybody get so excited about a game, pull out a playbook, figure out what's going on. I'm sort of looking at these guys scratching their rear ends and sort of, picking their nose and so forth, and hitting a home run and stealing first base on the third strike because the pitcher dropped the ball, the catcher dropped the ball and so forth. It was not bad, but I did detect the excitement, even when you ran from the cab to get the ticket so you wouldn't miss a nanosecond of the game. Okay, all right, okay. So I just wanted to be sure anybody who's watching this knows that you are a fanatic when it comes to baseball.
Yes, I am. I agree. I admit to that.
And that's perfectly okay. I will stay up at night watching cricket. Okay. On the return to MIT, this is where quite a few things start to happen. So you want to comment about people there who influenced your directions based on your reading at Caltech and where things went to, ecological optimality, Jules Charney, these kinds of things?
Yeah, I got back to MIT in 1976, and I took the work that I had done at Caltech, these 7 papers, to Jules Charney, the late Jules Charney, who was a professor in meteorology at MIT, a famous one, who had done a lot of work with climate. In fact, climate in the Sahel part of Africa, as a matter of fact. He had his own theory as to why that drought had happened. So I took this to him, and he had become involved in research for NASA. And he gave me the entree to NASA to start funding for this ecological optimality work.
Which was an unusual path for someone from a civil engineering department to be taking at that time.
Yeah, it was.
Some elements of remote sensing, yeah.
And another thing happened at about that same time. I was serving on the advisory committee to the Department of Civil Engineering at Princeton University and went there for a meeting. And they had, as a member of their advisory group, one of the people at NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab. In fact, he was the director of that laboratory, Joseph Smagorinsky. And Joe was very prominent in the field of numerical modelers, since the GFDL was a numerical modeling laboratory, numerical modelers doing large-scale work on climate. And he was the chairman of the Joint Scientific Committee of the Global Atmospheric Research Program, which is a World Meteorological Organization operation. And he needed at that time to set up a new committee because they had found, or they suspected, that the land surface processes, the hydrologic processes, were not being treated adequately in their climate models. So they were going to set up a working group on land surface processes. And he asked me, on the basis of what I had done, he had read it and heard from other people, would I chair that group? And I said yes. Because one of the outcomes of my Caltech work was I had cast my lot with a large-scale problem, and I thought, here's my real entree to get into it. So also on that committee were some other names that are distinguished, quite distinguished. Jim Doug surfaced again there. The late Yale Mintz, who was a meteorologist, a well-known meteorologist working for NASA, and Suki Manabe, who was also on the staff at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory.
A great colleague.
A great person. and many other meteorologists and climatologists. And the work of this committee led to a scientific meeting at Greenbelt, which really, I think, opened a dialogue between meteorologists and hydrologists. After that, things seemed to go much easier. There was better interchange between the two groups. And it also benefited me a lot personally because I became known across other areas, other sections of geophysics. And I think it probably played a role in my ultimate election as president of the AGU.
Right. I understand there. The book that came out, the 1982 book, you feel very good about that because of the influence that it had in tying together.
Yes, I do. Yeah,
Right.
That was the proceedings of that conference.
Right. One other thing that I was thinking of picking up here, Pete, is at the same time you're carrying on your personal research and going through to ecological optimality, and it's sort of, we're going through thinking about how various patches of grass, trees, etc. were forming and so on, and very, very important up to do that. But it's interesting that I happen to be editor of the journal Water Resources Research at the time, and here was a colleague starting to tell people who are used to thinking mainly in terms of physical hydrology about the importance of biology, plant vegetation. There's quite a lot of hydrology that includes that, but starting to look at a question, why do these things, why do we find plants in certain places? So it was pulling across plant ecology, very different from what most hydrologists were used to doing. And this led to a two-part paper, the first of them in April of 1982, Ecological Optimality in Water-Limited Natural Soil Vegetation Systems. Part 1, Theory and Hypothesis, and Part 2, Tests and Applications. And I think this is a defining piece of work that really influenced where things were to go. And again, the abstract, the part there, the solution space of an approximate statistical dynamic model of the average annual water balance is explored with respect to the hydrologic parameters of both soil and vegetation. Within the accuracy of this model, it is shown that water-limited natural vegetation systems are in stable equilibrium with their climatic and pedologic environments when the canopy density and species act to minimize average water demand stress. So this is an outgrowth of quite a few things that came into play there. And in following along, the interesting part as editor at the time, and I never even had to invoke what was known as the Walter Langbein doctrine. If something is controversial, you publish it, even if it may be wrong. I was able to go out, and at that stage it was important to get people from several fields to review a piece of work, and they each said, well, you know, there's a little missing here and there's a little missing there, but collectively it made sense to combine the lot, and it's given us a lot to think about. And thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay.
Given me a lot to think about, too.
There's the follow-on to that particular paper. You took it on Water-Limited Equilibrium of Savanna Vegetation Systems with Rafael Segarra in 1995.
85.
Sorry,
85.
85. Well, that's not too bad. We've been going for a while. We're allowed a few slips as how we go up there. But I think there was one of the very, very significant parts that came into play was the call to the community in the special issue of the Journal of Water Resources Research in August of 1986. And the title of that particular paper, The Emergence of Global Scale Hydrology. That was where you really put down for the community all of these paths and patterns that mattered to see where things are likely to go. I think we need to perhaps follow on a little bit at this stage, because we're now starting to get into issues of Water Science and Technology Board and the Blue Book and things like that.
Yeah, I think that paper on emergence of global scale hydrology is a key one leading into that, Steve. It seemed to me that we had to begin to treat the global scale, regional and global scale issue if we were going to cope with the emerging problems of environmental change and the problem and capitalize on the possibilities of long-range forecasting.
Okay.
So that's why I wrote that paper, and I think it has had a great effect, and that's what got me started with the business and with the academy. And I think I should say that it began with my election as president of the AGU.
Right.
And at that time, two of our colleagues came to me, one of them Marshall Moss and the other one Vijay Gupta, and urged me to use the presidential platform to further the scientific evolution of hydrology, which I agreed to do. In fact, he didn't have to urge me, and I devoted really the next 5 years of my career to doing that, and exclusively, really. I didn't do much else for about 5 years.
And Pete, this is the book that came forth.
Yes, this came forth from the National Research Council Water Science and Technology Board study that I proposed and that we put together, and that was a marvelous experience because we had a group of people from all branches of water science and engineering working together, and I think it was an exciting experience for everyone.
It was a privilege for me to serve ex officio as a member of the Water Science and Technology Board at the time. And that was a truly exciting gathering of people and collegiality.
Yes.
That was a key part. I think the focus on the science of hydrology was one of the really significant parts there.
It was, because in order to deal with the large-scale issues, it required our interfacing with the oceanographers, with the meteorologists, and I think as a field we've always operated as second fiddle, because we haven't had the stature with the other geosciences that I think we deserve, and it's been our fault because we haven't developed the scientific side as we needed to. So part of the effort was to make it clear to readers from outside the field of hydrology that here indeed there is a science with interesting questions that they can bring their physics and their oceanography and their meteorology to bear upon, which are important to understanding of the way the world system works. And that will elevate the status of our field and accomplish our goals of tooling up to look at large-scale problems. And I think it's working.
This was an important book in my view. First of all, Robert Horton had given a call to the community in 1931 about the development of the science. Walter Langbein had done it in 1962, and here we have in 1991 the book Opportunities in Hydrologic Sciences, from another generation doing the best they can to try and build the science out of a very, very complex body of material. I just want to read from the conclusions here because they are very important conclusions in my view. And in the conclusions on page 16 of the book, to meet emerging challenges to our environment, we must devote more attention to the hydrologic science underlying water's geophysical and biogeochemical role in supporting life on the Earth. The needed understanding will be built from long-term, large-scale coordinated data sets, and in a departure from current practices, it will be founded on a multidisciplinary education emphasizing the basic sciences. And the multidisciplinary is the key part here. The supporting educational and research infrastructure must be put in place. The benefits society will ultimately receive from a thorough scientific understanding of water behavior are many. Advances in the areas of irrigation, drinking water and groundwater supplies, improved recreational areas and wildlife habitat, and flood and drought forecasting and planning are only a few examples. Improved hydrologic science will provide a foundation for decision-making resulting in protection and improved management of the world's water resources. But the fundamental part in there is the basic sciences and the interdisciplinary part there. And that was a real joy to work on. That and the duties as President-elect, President of AGU, and immediate past President and your leadership there really kept you very, very busy until your formal retirement in 1993. I think you've been busier still since then. Would you like to comment on your continuing work on optimality?
Yeah, very briefly. What I'm trying to do is to define the location and the structure and the water use characteristics of natural vegetation canopies from natural selection principles. This will give us another set of equations to work with when we're trying to model the land surface boundary condition. And it really is a follow-on of the ecological optimality work. And it's terribly exciting again, and I can't wait to get to the office every day. I hope I finish it before I die.
I hope so
and
too.
The thing about it, Steve, is that these problems, to me, have an intrinsic beauty that transcends their rather large practical importance as well. And I feel very privileged to be have been able to work on them, paid to work on them for all these years.
You happen to have been working in a first-rate institution with first-rate colleagues. That makes a huge difference too.
That's true. I recognize that, and I thank them all for their help along the way. And in fact, I think I would say that since I couldn't hit a curveball, there's nothing I would rather have done with my life.
I understand, Pete. What advice would you give to a younger colleague starting in research these days?
Before I do that, do I have a couple of minutes to bring you up to date on my children? We put that off back further, and
why don't we do that?
I'd
Yeah.
just like to tell you what happened to them after the upbringing you know a little bit about. Helen graduated from Lesley College in Cambridge, and is now an elementary school teacher in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And she has 3 girls, the oldest of which is just finishing her freshman year in college. Peter Jr. is now, on a part-time basis, finishing his Master of Science in Physical Education at the University of South Florida, and is a school teacher in Tampa, in the Tampa, Florida school system. He's unmarried. Jeffrey did an MS in Foreign Affairs at Columbia University and was a lobbyist on Capitol Hill for about 10 years, until I convinced him he should get a real job. And he moved out to the state of Washington and is living on the Olympic Peninsula, and owns and operates a fish restaurant in Paulsbo, Washington. He has 2 children. Bev brought 4 children to the marriage, as I told you. The oldest, William, is a graduate of Rochester University, Denver University, and Harvard in law, and is a law professor at the University of Akron. Bob is a systems analyst with McDonnell Douglas in Los Angeles. He did not go to college yet. He's may or may not. Nancy is product, I don't know what the fancy term is. She handles the advertising and more for a software firm in Massachusetts. And Cindy got an SM also from the Foreign Affairs School at Columbia and works for the Commerce Department. Cindy has 2 children and Nancy has 1. So we have 8 grandchildren.
So that takes care of your spare time.
That takes care of the spare time.
I understand, Pete. That you've seen a real progression.
Oh yes.
You've seen the natural progression.
I regret that I didn't take the time, didn't have it and didn't take it to spend with my own children to appreciate all the stages of their growth and to give them more of myself. I'm trying to not make the same mistake with my grandchildren.
This is not uncommon in other cultures where people are stressed out. A couple of last things to wrap up here. Advice in research. What would you advise young colleagues to do?
Pick a tough problem, an important one, but a tough one, and go for the gold.
And go for the gold.
Don't be afraid to take an intellectual risk. Don't be afraid of failing. But above all, persevere.
That sounds pretty sensible to me, Pete. Called where I grew up, have a go. I just want to finish up here now with an observation by a colleague who wrote to you, we shan't name our colleague, on the occasion of you being awarded the Stockholm Water Prize, or the announcement of it. And he said, I recall your conscious decision to move in the then arcane field of hydrology with the purpose of bringing a new degree of scientific rigor to it. Given the state of hydrology at that time, you must have had to deal with many skeptics and perhaps even experienced a few doubts of your own. I also recall vividly your struggling to choose between a career in senior level academic administration or a return to serious scholarship following your tenure as department head. Both of these reflections typify the Eagleson characteristics I have most admired over the years. That is your ability to define a goal and then focus with incredible intensity and single-mindedness on its achievement. The sign that once hung over your office door that you already mentioned, "Go, go, go," was no mere slogan. Rather, it captured the level of commitment you brought to every important task. And that is something that I've known as a key characteristic of you. When you say you will do it, it is done. Last part to just return now to Robert Horton and hydrology and the importance of hydrologic science. In Robert Horton's 1931 paper, The Field, Scope, and Status of the Science of Hydrology, Transactions of AGU, June of 1931. As a pure science, hydrology deals with the nature, the natural occurrence, distribution, and circulation of water on, in, and over the surface of the earth. Defining science as correlated knowledge, it is true that a statement of the field, scope, and status of hydrology at the present time may be little more than a birth certificate. Nevertheless, there is scattered through scientific and engineering literature a mass of quantitative results adequate to make a most respectable body of science, wanting only to be coordinated. The harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pete, through your efforts, we have certainly well advanced beyond the birth certificate. And thank you from a grateful community.
Thank you, Steve.